Okay, Matt, why don't we go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Angularjs webinar. I'm going to just take a couple of minutes to go over some housekeeping. On the left-hand side of your screen, you will see a chat bar. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in there, and we'll go over questions and answers at the end of the webinar. And at this time, I will hand it over to Matt.
Thank you, April. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Silver. I'm a Senior Technical Instructor for WebAge Solutions. WebAge actually provides a broad spectrum of regular and customized training classes in programming, systems administration, and architecture, and we've been doing so for quite some time. Today's talk is on AngularJS. In this talk, I'll describe what AngularJS is. I'll look at the anatomy of an AngularJS application. We'll talk about a popular design pattern that some of you might be familiar with called MVC, or Model View Controller. We'll see that it's also applicable to an AngularJS application. We'll see that AngularJS employs two key concepts, one of which is referred to as data binding, the other of which is referred to as dependency injection, and we'll talk about how those work. We'll also talk a little bit about HTTP server communication. A lot of web applications these days communicate with a backend using HTTP, so we'll see that AngularJS certainly supports that feature. And last but not least, if you're interested in learning more about AngularJS or some of our other courses, we'll talk about some of our offerings that you might want to take thereafter. So in the first section, I'll describe what is AngularJS. AngularJS is actually a JavaScript framework that we use for building front-end applications, really specifically the front end of a web-based application. The AngularJS is actually open source, so you can actually view the source code. It's available under the MIT license, which is generally better for corporations since they don't actually have to open source the projects that they work on that, in this case, employ Angular. Angular itself was developed back in 2009 by a group of developers who worked at Bradtech. Since then, though, those developers became Google employees, and Google is the company that continues to actually further the platform. Just in case you're wondering, the version of AngularJS that I am focused on in this particular presentation is 1.x, really the most recent version of which is 1.4. Actually, 1.5 is still in beta. There is an Angular 2 that just actually got released to beta, which is significantly different than Angular 1. Again, the focus in this particular webinar is going to be on Angular 1. AngularJS, why should I actually bother to use it? There are lots of JavaScript frameworks that are out there that can be used for building the actual front end. For example, a lot of companies have used a popular framework called jQuery. We'll see that AngularJS is quite a bit different from jQuery. Also, we'll see that it can do things for us that jQuery can't do so easily. AngularJS tends to excel at many different things. One of the things that I mentioned on the very first slide that I went through, which just provided the talking points for the talk itself, was something called binding, specifically data binding. We'll see that AngularJS provides us with two-way data binding, which lets us manipulate the DOM without having to write nearly as much code as we would if we were going off and using jQuery. Data binding is something that we're going to go into more detail on a little bit later, but basically data binding has to do with binding information between our view layer and between our model layer. The model corresponds with our business data. If I make a change to the actual business data, that particular change should be reflected in the view. The view corresponds with what the user sees, in essence, the user interface. Likewise, if I go off and I make a change to the actual view, for example, I have an input field, I type a new value into that corresponding field, then I should see that change reflected in the model. We'll see that AngularJS actually synchronizes automatically between the model and the view. Whereas if you were to go off and use jQuery, you'd have to write a lot of code to actually accomplish that. We'll see that AngularJS also employs HTML templates. An HTML template is really just an HTML document, but we'll see that there is some special elements contained inside that are Angular specific. These templates are used to actually construct the view, which really consists of the DOM that gets generated by the actual browser and Angular in conjunction with one another. We'll see that using Angular, we can create fairly complex DOM element structures. Again, you could do so using jQuery or using the DOM API for that matter, but it would require a lot more work. The other thing that AngularJS actually excels at is developing single-page applications. A single-page application loads a single HTML document from the server and then typically shows different DOM elements to create the illusion of multiple-page navigation. So AngularJS is very well equipped to go off and do so. It could even deal with things such as managing navigation state for you, which is important if you want to be able to go off and click the back button and go back to the previous state of the page. So basically, if you're trying to create an SPA-style type application, or if you need to do a lot of complex DOM manipulations, AngularJS is something that you want to consider. Now, traditionally, when it comes to going off and creating the view layer of your application, we've used server-side based technologies, including JSPs, that is Java Server Pages, ASPs, Active Server Pages, or PHPs. What's nice about Angular is that it allows us to go off and move this logic that's focused again on rendering our view to the browser side. And AngularJS, again, employs its own templating engine to process those HTML templates and construct the DOM that we ultimately see within our actual browser. Also, traditionally, when it comes to controlling the page flow, we use controllers. For example, for those of you familiar with Java, we oftentimes use servlets or Spring, which is a popular Java-based technology, uses controllers, which are really just Java classes that are managed by the Spring container but perform the same role as a servlet. It's possible to, again, also move this logic to the browser side using, in this case, Angular. So in summary, Angular lets us move most of the view and the controller logic, for that matter, to the browser. So the true model layer business logic would reside still on the server side, and these days most companies are going off and providing access to this business logic using RESTful web services. Some of you might be familiar with SOAP-based web services. RESTful web services are another form of web service that we can use to access this information, but tends to be a lot easier to build, and so that's become much more popular in recent years. AngularJS, though, is much broader in terms of scope than jQuery, which again is in essence just a wrapper around the DOM API. It makes it a lot easier to manipulate the DOM API, but it's really nothing more than that. We'll see that AngularJS does provide us more capabilities, but it also has a slightly larger learning curve. So now that we've talked a little bit about what AngularJS is and why we use it, Next, we're going to look at a simple AngularJS application, and we'll talk about the different components that make up the actual application itself. So the application that we're going to take a look at is your generic Hello World application, except this time we've gone ahead and implemented it using AngularJS. You'll see that our web front end here consists of a input text field. You'll notice that the input text field currently contains the text that we've typed in, Hello World, and you'll see below it a label, or really just some text, you entered, colon, and then the text that we entered up here, Hello World, along with an exclamation point. So the idea is that any text that I type into this field is going to be displayed here after the you entered colon. So on the next slide, you'll notice here is our actual HTML template. It looks more or less like a normal HTML document, but if you look closely, you'll see a few attributes and other elements that are not part of the HTML language. HTML is fairly limited in terms of the tags that we can go off and use. So the nice thing about Angular is that it provides us with some extensions that, again, allow us to actually manipulate the DOM. So the first thing you'll notice that we have here in bold is just our doc type, which is the new way of going off and declaring an HTML document, specifically an HTML5 document. You'll notice that in the head section we have a script tag, and the script tag is referencing Angular. Angular consists of one JavaScript file. In this case, we're using the minified version of Angular, which is better for performance. For a development-based site, you may want to use the non-minified version. This way you can easily see the different objects and methods and fields that make up the Angular API. But for production, we typically use the minified version because it's smaller. There's all the white space has been removed, etc. The next thing you'll notice is that inside of our body elements, or body tag here, start tag, we have an ngapp attribute. This ngapp attribute we'll see is referred to as a directive, and this is one of the built-in directives. What this ngapp attribute does is it signifies the starting point of our actual Angular application. Angular is going to be responsible for basically manipulating the body element of our page. We'll see that we can place this ngapp attribute elsewhere, but oftentimes we place it on the body tag. Some people even place it on the HTML tag. If you look at the input field, which again is where we typed that hello world message from before, you'll notice that there is another attribute which also starts with ng. ng, by the way, is short for Angular. In this case, we have ng model. And you'll see that this is assigned a string value of message. What we're basically going off and doing is specifying that the value that we type inside of this actual text field is going to be stored inside of the model layer that's provided by Angular inside of a variable called message. Now initially, when this page first gets loaded, what's going to happen is Angular is going to go off and read the value of message and display it inside of the corresponding text field. Well, message itself is actually going to not have a value initially, so initially the actual text field is going to be blank. But when I type something into this particular text field, like we saw in the previous slide, again here we saw hello world, what's going to happen is this model is going to get updated. Now this is all going to happen without me having to write any kind of synchronization code, which is something that you would normally have to go off and do using, for example, jQuery. On the next line, you'll see an example of another type of element or artifact that we have in Angular called a binding. Bindings are surrounded with double curly braces. So you'll see we have two open curly braces, we have two closed curly braces, And nested inside, we have the name of the model variable that we specified here. Again, we attach our text field to this model variable called message, and now we are referencing it here. This is actually an example of an expression, and expressions are enclosed in these double curly braces, I should say. What this is going to do is actually read the value that's stored inside of the message variable and display it back to the user. So the resulting DOM is going to not contain this double curly brace message, close double curly brace. Instead, this will be replaced with the value of message, which in this case is going to be hello world. If I change the value inside the text field, for example, if I changed it to goodbye world, then this will automatically change as well. So again, this is a very simple AngularJS application, but it illustrates some of the major points. Again, this is an example of a template. Inside of this template, we're using these two directives, ng-app and ng-model. And we also have an example of a binding. So next we talk a little bit about the building blocks of an AngularJS application. The primary one that we had seen was a directive. A directive is going to be some custom HTML element or attribute that does not exist as part of standard HTML. ng-app and ng-model are just two examples of that. We have many other directives, such as ng-repeat. We'll see the ng-repeat, an example of that later. We'll see that's used for repeating a DOM element and its children. So any display logic that you want to be able to reuse, you would place inside of custom directives. That is, you're not limited to just the directives that come with Angular, such as these three that I mentioned, but you can also go off and create your own. Another component or building block that we have of an AngularJS application is a filter. A filter can be used for formatting data. So for example, if you have some number that corresponds with somebody's salary, you can go off and use the currency filter to go off and actually format that. If you have something that's a date, you can go off and format that however you see fit. And also what's nice is that the Angular can go off and use the browser's locale, so depending upon what country you live in, you can go off and format it appropriately. Another building block that we commonly use when constructing an AngularJS application is something referred to as a service. Services contain pure business logic that is view independent. So it's used for performing some sort of a business function. For example, you might want to go off and compute some results. You might want to go off and convert money from one currency to another currency. Those are examples of business logic. Now, truth be told, we try to minimize the amount of business logic that we have inside of on the actual client side. That again is view independent. So normally your services are actually reaching out to your remote web services. Again, typically these are RESTful services to perform this business logic. And for that matter, to get back business data or supply it with business data. So this is another kind of component that we have, or building block. We also have providers, which are used for configuring services. Another major building block that we have, which we're going to see an example of coming up, is controllers. Controllers are used for handling user input events. They can also be used for pre-populating our actual view. They can also be used for communicating with the service. If you have a single-page application that you're implementing, again using Angular, it's also used for helping to control the page flow. We also have the notion of a module. A module you can think of as a package which contains the other types of building blocks or artifacts I was referring to, such as your directives, your controllers, your filters, your services, etc. Okay, so we've looked at a simple application. Now we're going to look at another, now we're going to discuss the MVC Design Pattern and how that relates here to AngularJS. Again, MVC stands for Model View Controller. So Model View Controller is typically used in GUI-based applications, such as web applications. MVC has many benefits, which is why we tend to use it. It allows us to provide a separation of concerns. Each layer, the model layer, the view layer, the controller layer, have different concerns associated with them. The model typically corresponds with your business logic and business data. The view corresponds with the user interface. The controller is really the middleman between them. Model View Controller also provides us with easier testability because we can substitute one layer for another. For example, we can replace the model with some other model layer, or we can change the view with some other view. And also it provides us with reuse. We can reuse, for example, the same model objects across many applications. And we can just simply change the view, and we could have the other applications would just have different view controller components. So as I mentioned, the model layer typically contains our business logic and business data. From an Angular perspective, we use JavaScript objects to house this data, and we use services that we just briefly mentioned before to contain our business logic. Again, the services normally reach out to a server, again using a web service, to actually invoke the true business logic and access the true business data. The controller layer in our AngularJS application is composed of controllers. We'll see again that these can be used for handling user input events. They can be used for pre-populating a view with data, and they can be used for interacting with the model layer. The view layer is made up of the HTML templates. We saw an example of one so far. We'll see another one coming up. They also consist of the custom directives that we can go off and create. They also consist of filters that we saw that we can use for example, doing things like currency conversion and other kinds of formatting. So basically, any kinds of display rendering logic, any kinds of data formatting, any kinds of styling, would be handled by the view layer. So next we're going to look at a MVC application that was implemented using, in this case, Angular. This application is also fairly simple, a little bit more complicated than the one before, but still very simple. In this case, we have a login screen. You'll see that we enter our email address, our password, then we click the login message, and either it indicates that we were unsuccessful or we were successful. Anybody can log on but Daffy Duck, poor Daffy Duck. So if he tries to log on, he is denied access. Whereas if Bugs Bunny, for example, tries to log on, he is allowed access. So once again, we're going to take a look at the view. Specifically, we're going to look at the actual template that we would go off and create. And you'll see it looks somewhat similar to before. Notice that we actually have two scripts now instead of one. Again, we have the Angular script that we require. We also have this custom script that we've gone off and created where we placed our JavaScript code instead of polluting it inside of the actual template. So now it's actually stored inside of the login.js file. Notice that our body tag, again, has an ng-app attribute, really our directive. But this time, instead of not assigning it a value, we are assigning it a value. So if we look back at the example from earlier, you'll notice that the ng-app did not actually get assigned a value, whereas here it actually does. What we're actually assigning it is a module. We spoke before about the fact that a module is a building block in Angular, as used to store a collection of artifacts, such as, again, our controllers, our services, our filters, our custom directives, etc. So we're referencing the module that we want Angular to load when it encounters this, after we download this particular page, including this Angular JavaScript file. We also have another directive here, which is the ng controller directive. And the ng controller directive here is used to reference a controller object called loginctrl, which is short for controller. Technically, when this directive gets processed, what will happen is an instance of this controller will be created and initialized. We also have here an email field. Notice that this corresponds with an input field of type text. We could have used email, which is one of the new HTML5 types, but we didn't. And notice again we have the ng model. The ng model again is a directive, and this is used to bind really the email to this corresponding user info object, which is a JavaScript object that contains this email property. We'll take a look again at the JavaScript code momentarily. If we continue the example, you'll notice that we also have a password field. This one is type password. Again, we're using ng model, and we're binding the value that we typed into the password field to this, again, this user info object, which also has a password property. We also have a button. And notice that we used another directive called ng-click. By the way, all the Angular directives are prefixed with ng-, so you quickly and easily know they are Angular specific. And this is in place of an onClick event handler. So normally if you were going off and using a button tag, you would have onClick equals some JavaScript function. In this case, we use ng-click because otherwise Angular doesn't know about this login function. This basically hooks us up into the Angular framework. So when I click this login button, we call this login method. Last but not least, again, we have another binding. Again, we have our double curly braces at the beginning and the end. And we have message. So the message itself is, again, a variable. We don't see the message here. Instead, we'll see that within the controller class, the message itself is defined, and really all we're doing here is rendering the value. So we're reading the value, converting this to a string, and displaying it back to the user inside of this paragraph elements. Okay, so that is our template. Here is our controller. So this actually corresponds with the login.js file that I mentioned here. If you look at the login.js, you'll see that it starts with a call to the module method, which is defined on the Angular variable. The Angular is a global variable that's defined inside of the actual Angular min.js file that we saw before. The module is used for defining a module. You'll see that the module method here actually takes two arguments. The first argument corresponds with the name of the module, which is just simply a string. We could use double quotes or single quotes. In this case, we're using single quotes. And the name of the module here corresponds with simple app. You'll see that this name here corresponds with the name that we supply to the ng app attribute. So basically that tells Angular to go off and load this module. The second argument that we supply to the module method here is an array. In JavaScript, arrays are enclosed in square brackets. And this would correspond with any dependencies that this module has on other modules. It is possible when it comes to developing an Angular application to subdivide your application into more than one module. For simple applications, you'll probably just have one module, but for more complicated applications, you may choose to actually subdivide them. That is, you might choose to group together your controllers, your directives, your filters, etc., into multiple modules. This module method here, when you first call it, will create the module, and it will return a reference back to the module object. That module object can then be, what you can do is you can chain a call to the controller method, which is used for defining an Angular controller. If you want to, you could also break this up into two separate statements. So you could assign this to a variable, for example, called mod, and then you could do mod.controller. But oftentimes, you'll just simply chain the method calls together, which is what we're doing here. The controller method, which is available to you again on the module object for simple app, also takes two arguments. The first argument corresponds with the name of the controller. This is loginctrl, which again corresponds with the name that we have here. So again, when Angular is processing this page, it sees loginctrl, so what it's going to go off and do is instantiate this login controller. The second argument that we supply to the controller method is what we call a constructor function. A constructor function is used for creating a new instance of my JavaScript object, in this case my login controller. What we're supplying to this actual function is a $scope, which is an example of a service that is provided to us by Angular. Anything that starts with a dollar really is coming in this case from Angular. And we can think of the scope as basically a data storage area. Any model variables can actually be specified here on the scope. It can also be used for specifying the behavior of our controller. And this is actually an example of dependency injection. Angular is going to actually go off and call this controller method when it processes the page, and it will automatically inject this scope service or object into our controller. We don't have to instantiate it. It's injected. I'll talk again more about dependency injection a little bit later. So notice that the scope object is being used to define a user info property. A user info property, which itself is of type object. Notice that we have curly braces here, which denotes the beginning and end of our object. And the object has two properties, email and password, both of which we initialize to empty strings. In JavaScript, for those of you who are not as familiar, objects are basically maps, which consist of key-value pairs. And when it comes to defining a new object, you can actually do so using this syntax. This also looks very much like the JSON syntax that some of you might be familiar with. We're also defining another model variable here called message on the scope, which we've initialized to please log in. So actually, initially, if I were to go off and actually open this particular page up in the browser, you would see the message down here, please log in. Remember, we're using this binding here to go off and actually render that value. So again, we have user info. Here's the email and the password properties, which we had seen were bound to the two corresponding input fields, email and password. Last but not least, we have our login method. Now, in JavaScript, when you go off and define a method is really nothing more than a property of an object that is of function type. So here, to define the method, we say login, scope.login equals some function. Now, this function doesn't take any parameters. And in JavaScript, we do not have to specify a return value like we have to in some other languages like Java. Now, in real life, this particular function would actually invoke a model layer function. For example, it might go off and communicate with a service that we could inject into our controller. We haven't done that here. Which would in turn probably communicate with a web service. But for simplicity, we place the business logic inside of our controller. So you'll see that we just have an if-else statement here. It's checking to see whether or not the value of email on the user info property or scope variable is equal to daffy@wv.com. And if it is, notice it sets the message here to bad user login failed. So again, Daffy can't log in. He's not given access to this application. Whereas anybody else, such as Bugs Bunny, can. So otherwise, we set the message property equal to login was successful. So that is our controller. So the controller is pre-populating this view. Again, whatever values that we have for the email and for the password are initially displayed back to the user along with the message property. Again, the email and the password are empty strings. The message property is please log in. When I click on this button, we said that this login method, which is defined on our controller class, gets called, and it just checks to see if it's Daffy. If it is, again, it blocks him. Otherwise, it allows access. So the model here really corresponds with the variables that we're defining in this case on the actual scope object. The view corresponds with our template. Really the resulting DOM that gets generated when the page gets processed inside of the browser. And the controller corresponds with this login CTRL class. And the controller is part of this module simple app. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about MVC, next we talk about data binding and dependency injection in a little bit more detail. We've seen both being employed in these applications. So we actually have two types of data binding. We have one-way and we have two-way data binding. And AngularJS actually supports both forms of data binding. When we have the bindings, which contain our AngularJS expressions, again, these are surrounded by double curly braces. This is an example of a one-way data binding. So one-way data bindings are just used purely for rendering purposes. So we're rendering the value of some model object, and we're either doing so as a text node or as an attribute of an HTML element. So in the first case, we have a text node. That's what's nested inside of our paragraph elements. And in the second case, we have a class attribute, so whatever the class name is, this would be the CSS class, not a JavaScript class, will be substituted here. Two-way data binding is a little bit more powerful, and this basically provides us with read-write access. It allows us to synchronize the model with the view. Actually, in both cases, we're synchronizing the model with the view. But the idea here is that instead of just reading values from the model and displaying them back like we're doing in the case of the one-way data binding, here we can also go off and change. If we make a change to the view, the model will automatically be updated, as well as vice versa. So again, initially, when we render this text box, we're going to read in the value of the email property of our user info object. Whereas if I go off and I start to change this value, AngularJS will automatically go off and update the value of the bound object for every key press that I make. So you don't have to go off and submit a form. Again, this is client-side. So if you were to inspect the corresponding model object, you would see every time I type a character, that email field is getting updated. So the two-way data binding is a powerful feature. And again, you don't have to write code to make this happen. Dependency injection is another powerful feature of AngularJS, something that we don't have with jQuery. Dependency injection is really a design pattern that some of you might be familiar with, which lets us use objects without knowing how or when such objects are created. In essence, you're just simply handed an object, and you can go off and use it. Oftentimes, in applications, what do? Oftentimes, we have to instantiate a class. Then we're responsible for going off and configuring it. Hopefully, we know how to configure it. Or we go off and we use some object to go off and look up the object that we're actually dependent on or that we're interested in. The problem with those techniques, though, is the fact that if you want to go off and substitute another object later on, for example, for testing, you might want to use a mock object. It becomes a lot harder because you're tightly coupled to that object, especially if you're going off and instantiating it. Whereas with dependency injection, we can easily substitute in the object that is being supplied at runtime with a new object, one that could be used again possibly for test purposes, again a mock object. We also talk about a situation where if we have an object such as object A, that in this case depends on object B, and B in turn depends on object C, then what's nice is Angular will go off and actually initialize that entire chain of dependencies automatically for us. So we don't have to worry about the object lifecycle management, in this case the initialization. There are several different ways to do dependency injection when it comes to Angular, but the one that is most popular and the one that we've actually seen so far is to actually inject our objects in the initialization functions, such as the constructor function that we saw before for the controller. Likewise, for services, we can do something similar. For example, a service can be dependent on other services. Services are never dependent on controllers because, remember, controllers are view-specific, but services are not. So on the next slide, we see an example here which illustrates these concepts. Notice that our module here called Simple App, which doesn't have any dependencies on any of their modules, actually is defining both a service and a controller. So service and controller are both methods available to you on the module object. And you'll see that the service here, this is one way of creating a service. Again, we're using a constructor function here to go off and create it. This service is called MyService. Here we have our controller, which is called testctrl. Notice that this testctrl again has a constructor function which is used for initializing your controller, and it takes two parameters. These are two dependencies. So we're injecting in, again, that scope object that we spoke about before. Again, this is our data storage area. And we're also injecting in MyService. If we look at the next slide, and then we'll come back to this one for a second, notice that the ng controller is being referenced inside of a div tag here. So when this ng controller gets referenced, what's going to happen at that point is Angular is going to go off and instantiate the test controller, but before it can go off and complete the perform the instantiation or complete the instantiation, it has to go off and actually inject inside here the scope and the MyService. Now, if this MyService has not yet been instantiated, it in turn also needs to be instantiated. So notice here that the service MyService actually is also dependent on something, in this case another service. Remember that services that come from Angular always have a $sign at the beginning, and in this case here we have the HTTP service that we're going to talk more about coming up. This is used for web service communication or web server communication. So before, again, this controller can be instantiated, the MyService needs to be instantiated. If the HTTP service has not been yet instantiated, it would need to be instantiated. And then this service is just purely going off and just logging into our console, initializing MyService. So when this does get instantiated, you would see this message. Likewise, when the test controller gets instantiated, we're logging, in this case, initializing test control. So that is an example of dependency injection. By the way, services in AngularJS are singletons, controllers are not. So if you happen to have multiple controllers that are part of your module and they all use the MyService, only the first one that gets used will have to go off and instantiate the MyService. Any other controllers that utilize MyService will not have to wait for this to be instantiated because, again, it's already been instantiated. There's that one instance that we can employ. Also, this is something important to mention. The system, in this case Angular, discovers the artifacts, in this case our services, by matching the parameter names. So hence the ordering of the parameters does not matter. So if I want to, I could have the MyService first and then $scope, or I can have a $scope MyService. Ordering is not important. It's the names that are actually important. The last thing that we'll touch upon in this talk is HTTP server communication. When it comes to communicating with a remote web server or HTTP server, we use the HTTP service. The HTTP service actually leverages the browser's XML HTTP request object, which some of you I'm sure are familiar with. This is how we make AJAX calls. This is built into all modern-day browsers. It can also employ the JSON-P or JSON with padding communication technique, which can be used for communicating with other web servers. We can get over some of the restrictions that we have from a security perspective. Same domain policy. HTTP is actually fairly robust and fairly secure. It can also guard against JSON vulnerabilities, which sometimes occur, as well as cross-site request forgery, XSRF. JSON, by the way, is JavaScript object notation. It's a way of specifying a JavaScript object It uses that syntax that I was basically showing before when we were looking at the user info object, where we can specify the properties and the corresponding values. It's a little bit stricter, though, from a syntactical perspective, and it's normally used for data interchange between a client and a server. So, for example, instead of returning XML and having to parse that XML, you can return JSON and then just simply use that JavaScript object and access its properties very quickly and easily within your web page. So let's take a look at an example of using this HTTP service. In this case, we have some web service that returns back to us an array of JavaScript objects using the JSON notation that I was referring to. So notice that we have an array. Again, we have our square brackets. We have two objects. Again, we have curly braces. And notice that we actually are supposed to enclose the property names in quotes, whereas when we're just defining a JavaScript object, we don't have to do that. And in this case, we have two properties, name and value, and we have stock and 139.80 and cash and 234.99. Notice that what we want to do is we want to read back this information from our web server. And we want to display it in an HTML table. So each row in the table here corresponds with an object. So how do we accomplish that? Well, again, we're going to go off and we're going to define a controller. Notice that this module is called Data App. It has a controller called Data Controller. This controller here is we're going to inject two objects inside of it. We're going to inject the scope object and the HTTP service. Notice that we are using this HTTP service. It has a convenience method called GET. It also has POST and other methods that are named after the corresponding HTTP methods. When we call GET, we can supply the URL. In this case, we have /assets. And this is an asynchronous API. So what happens is when we call success here, what we're doing is we're registering the success event handler. So assuming that we get back something in the 200 range from our web server, or web service in this case, this particular callback invoked. So in this case, what's going to happen is when this callback function gets called, we're going to go off and set the assets variable or property of our scope variable equal to data. The data corresponds with the payload. That is what we get back from the actual web service. So here, sorry about that. You'll see that the payload that we get back is going to be this JavaScript array. You can also define an error callback function. So if you get something other than the 200 code, the error callback function would be called, you would call that error, and then you would supply, again, a callback function which would have the payload. But for this simple situation, we did not actually go off and register a error callback function. For those of you who are wondering, this uses the Promise API behind the scenes for asynchronously dealing with the web server. Last but not least, we have our view here, again, our template. Notice that, again, we're referencing our module data app, our controller data controller. We have a table here. We have a table row. And notice that we've nested inside of here yet another directive. Again, it starts with ng, in this case, ng repeat. And what we're going to do is we're going to iterate through each of the assets. Again, the assets is the variable that we're actually assigning our payload to, which is a JavaScript array. We want to iterate through each of the objects in that array. They will be stored inside of a variable here called A. And then we want to display, using our bindings, the name and the value, which again are going to correspond with stock and 139.80, and for that matter, cash and 234.99. So we'll create these two rows that we see here. Now the ng repeat directive actually is a special directive. What it goes off and does is it manipulates the DOM, and it repeats the element that it's nested inside of and any of its children. So this tr tag will be repeated in this case twice, and each one will have two columns, which will have the name and the value properties of our asset. Okay, so that concludes the real content portion of the actual webinar. Last but not least, we just talk about our offerings briefly. When it comes to Angular, we have two main offerings. We have 2425, which is an AngularJS programming class. This AngularJS programming class covers everything that we've covered here, plus a lot more. If you go and it goes into a lot more detail on Angular than we've had a chance to. We also have an introduction to responsive web development with AngularJS and Bootstrap. So if you are interested in learning about responsive web development, as well as Angular, responsive web development is used for creating web pages that look good on any kind of device, be it a mobile device or a desktop-based browser for that matter. This is the course that you might want to actually investigate. Bootstrap is actually employs CSS to create responsive web pages and can be integrated with Angular. So in conclusion, Angular is really just an open source JavaScript-based web application framework. It employs, again, the model view controller design pattern that is quite common in web page design. We saw that it supports both one-way and two-way data binding, which allows us to manipulate the DOM by just simply making changes to the model data. We saw that Angular also helps to bring structure to our code. It provides a separation of concerns, again, using MVC. And last but not least, we saw that Angular can communicate with a remote web server using the HTTP service. If you have any questions after the webinar itself is over, you can certainly try contacting me at my email address, matt.silver@web8solutions.com. Also, you can certainly contact WebAge more about any other questions that you might have. We also have a blog site that you might be interested in checking out. Also, if you just want to peruse more, find out more about AngularJS on your own, you can always go to their website and take a look. Okay, so thank you, everybody. At this point, are there any questions that I can try to answer?
Hey, Matt. Thanks for that. We do have a few questions. I would like to remind everyone that if you have a question, go ahead and post it to the chat box. One of the questions that came in was about getting a copy of the recording. The webinar has been recorded, and it will be sent out within the next couple of days to everyone that registered for the webinar. Also, Matt, there is a question about the sample code. Can we provide a copy of that?
The sample code?
Yes.
Yes, sure.
Okay. So Matt will send over the sample code, and I will give that to everyone. There's a second question, Matt, on how we can achieve security for our resources.
How you can achieve security for your resources?
Yes. Do we need to get further information on that for you to answer?
It's a little bit, yeah, I mean, the question is a little bit too generic for me to really properly answer.
Okay. So let me ask, give me one moment.
In terms of just securing resources, certainly you can just use standard application security mechanisms. You can force a user to have to log on to actually access the corresponding resource. So you can place it in an authenticated section of the website, but that's not anything specific in this case to Angular.
And how do you exchange the token?
Again, that's not something that's specific in this case to Angular. It really depends upon what kind of web application you're going off and creating, what kind of server-side technology you're using, and what kind of authentication mechanism you're going off and employing. You might be using single sign-on, you might be using SAML, you might be using OAuth. There's really nothing specific in this case from an Angular perspective. Oftentimes tokens correspond with cookies, and the cookies themselves are going to actually be passed to the browser initially after the user, for example, authenticates. And then whenever the user goes off and accesses that page going forward, the browser would go off and send that authentication token, which is embedded inside of a cookie, back to the server. So it's, again, it's really not an Angular specific question.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar here. Again, if you have registered for the webinar, you will get a follow-up with the recording of the webinar, which will have Matt's contact information. And if you have further questions, feel free to contact him. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, April. Have a great day.
Sure.
Thanks.